It is late autumn in the year 850, in a cramped, soot-stained laboratory in the Sichuan province of China. You are a Taoist alchemist, a man of science and mysticism, surrounded by ceramic jars and the pungent, heavy scent of minerals. Your hands are stained with charcoal and sulfur. You aren't interested in war, conquest, or the destruction of walls. In fact, you are searching for the exact opposite. You are trying to live forever. You are meticulously mixing a combination of honey, saltpeter, and sulfur, heating them over a controlled flame to create a medicine of immortality. But as the temperature rises, the mixture doesn't grant eternal life. It detonates. The resulting flash sears your skin and singes your beard, sending a shockwave through the room that knocks over your scrolls. This is the ultimate paradox of human history. The quest for the secret to life resulted in the invention of the most efficient tool for ending it. We began by looking for heaven, and we accidentally stumbled into the recipe for hell. You've probably been told that the invention of the gun was a singular, light bulb moment of genius, or that the people who first mixed gunpowder only ever used it for pretty light shows in the sky. By the way, that second one is a massive myth that we'll dismantle very shortly. In reality, the path from a failed medical potion to the modern firearm was a messy 800-year-long game of trial and error that spanned 3 continents and required dozens of cultures to fail upward until they got the chemistry right. It wasn't a straight line. It was a series of accidents that changed the physical shape of our world, literally changing the way we build our cities and how our societies are structured. If you think the gun was invented to give soldiers an advantage, you're missing the point. For the first few centuries of its existence, the gun was often more dangerous to the person holding it than the person it was pointed at. So how did we get from a singed beard in a 9th century lab to a weapon that could punch through steel from 100 yards away? Let's address the elephant in the room first, the fireworks myth. There is a very common, very comfortable story we tell ourselves that says ancient China invented gunpowder, but only used it for celebratory fireworks, while violent Europeans were the ones who realized it could be used for war. This is completely false. And quite frankly, it ignores the incredibly sophisticated military engineering of the Song dynasty. Within decades of that first accidental explosion in Sichuan, Chinese military texts were already describing fire arrows, arrows with small pouches of gunpowder attached to the shaft to act as primitive rocket boosters. By the year 1044, a military manual called the Wu Jing Zong Yao provided 3 different recipes for gunpowder specifically intended for use in combat. They weren't making pretty colors. They were making toxic smoke, incendiary bombs, and thunderclap grenades designed to deafen and disorient enemy horses. The transition from medicine to murder happened almost instantly. The core of this fire medicine, called huoyao in Chinese, relies on a specific chemical trinity. You need sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter. Sulfur and charcoal are the fuels. They provide the energy for the fire. But if you just light them on fire in the open air, they burn slowly. To get an explosion, you need a massive, instantaneous delivery of oxygen. That's where saltpeter, or potassium nitrate, comes in. Saltpeter is an oxidizer. When it gets hot, it releases a flood of oxygen that feeds the charcoal and sulfur, turning a simple campfire into a violent, expanding ball of gas. Early alchemists called saltpeter Chinese snow because of the white, crystalline way it formed on cave walls. They realized that the more snow they added to the mix, the more violent the reaction became, which, as you might imagine, led to a lot of burned-down laboratories before they found the right balance. But here's the problem that stumped engineers for the next 200 years. How do you contain that expanding gas? If you just set gunpowder on a table and light it, it goes poof. To make a gun, you have to trap that gas inside a tube so that the only way it can escape is by pushing a projectile out of the front. This sounds simple to us now, but in the 11th century, it was a death trap. The first guns weren't made of metal, they were made of bamboo. These were called fire lances. You would take a long, thick stalk of bamboo, strap it to the end of a spear, and pack it with gunpowder and small shards of porcelain or iron. During a battle, you'd light the fuse and thrust the spear at your enemy. It was essentially a one-shot flamethrower that spit out a cloud of fire and shrapnel. And if the bamboo was a little too dry or the gunpowder was a little too strong, the whole thing would shatter in your hands, sending splinters into your own face. The fire lance proved its worth during the Siege of Dian in 1132. Song dynasty defenders used these bamboo tubes to incinerate attacking soldiers who were trying to scale the walls with wooden ladders. It was terrifying, it was loud, and it changed the psychology of the battlefield forever. But it still wasn't a gun in the modern sense. It was a short-range, messy, incendiary tool. To turn the fire lance into a true firearm, humans had to solve the metallurgy wall. Bamboo is easy to find, but it's weak. To launch a heavy lead ball with enough force to kill someone at a distance, you need a barrel made of something that won't explode under pressure. You need metal. But in the 12th century, casting metal was mostly used for making bells or statues. Making a hollow, perfectly uniform metal tube that could survive a gunpowder blast was an engineering nightmare that took decades to solve. The breakthrough finally happened in the late 13th century. Archaeologists have found what is widely considered the world's oldest surviving true gun, the Heilongjiang hand cannon, dated to roughly 1288. It's a bronze tube about a foot long with a bulbous chamber at the back to hold the gunpowder. It doesn't look like a rifle. It looks like a heavy metal vase on a stick. Which, ironically, is exactly how it was used. You'd stick it on a wooden pole so you could hold it without burning your hands. By this point, the recipe for gunpowder had been perfected into a 75-15-10 ratio. 75% saltpeter, 15% charcoal, and 10% sulfur. This corned gunpowder was much more powerful than the early meal powder used by the alchemists. With a bronze barrel and high-quality powder, humans finally had a weapon that could project force across a distance. But why did it spread so fast? How did a secret from a Chinese lab end up in the hands of English knights and Ottoman janissaries within a single century? The answer lies with the Mongols. As Genghis Khan and his descendants swept across Asia, they didn't just take land, they took engineers. When the Mongols besieged Chinese cities, they encountered gunpowder firsthand. Rather than banning it, they absorbed it. They created artillery corps of Chinese engineers who traveled with the Mongol hordes, bringing gunpowder technology to the gates of Baghdad, the borders of India, and the fringes of Europe. The Mongol Empire acted as a massive, continental-scale delivery system for the very technology that would eventually make their own style of horse archer warfare obsolete. Talk about an unintended consequence. By the mid-1300s, the fire tube had arrived in Europe. But here's the strange thing. Europeans didn't use it for handguns at first. They went big. They built massive, cumbersome cannons called bombards. These were essentially giant iron pots that shot stone balls the size of watermelons. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, the English used primitive cannons against the French. They didn't actually kill many people with them. The stone balls were too slow and the aim was terrible, but the sound was a revelation. Chroniclers at the time described it as the noise of God, and it terrified the French horses so much that they threw their riders and trampled their own lines. For the first 50 years of European gunpowder use, the weapon's greatest power wasn't its ability to kill, it was its ability to cause a panic. This leads us to a fascinating survival question. If early guns were so inaccurate and slow to reload, why didn't we just stick with the longbow? A trained English archer could fire 12 arrows in a minute and hit a man-sized target at 200 yards. A soldier with a 14th century hand cannon was lucky to fire once every 3 minutes, and half the time the gun would just refuse to go off. And let's not forget that if it rained, your gunpowder turned into useless gray mud. The reason the gun won isn't because it was better than the bow. It's because it was easier to learn. To be a master archer, you had to train from childhood. You had to develop massive skeletal muscles and years of muscle memory. But you could take a peasant who had never fought a day in his life, give him a hand cannon, and teach him to fire it in a week. The gun democratized violence. It allowed a ruler to raise a massive, effective army in a fraction of the time it took to train traditional warriors. However, the hand cannon was still a logistical nightmare. To fire it, you needed two hands to hold the pole and a third hand to apply a burning ember to the touch hole on the top of the barrel. Unless you were a three-armed mutant, you couldn't aim and fire at the same time. You just pointed the tube in the general direction of the enemy and hoped for the best. This limitation created a massive innovation gap in the 1400s. Engineers realized that if the gun was ever going to be more than a psychological toy, they needed a way to trigger the explosion mechanically. They needed a lock. The first solution was the matchlock, which appeared around 1450. It was a simple S-shaped lever called a serpentine that held a slow-burning cord of hemp. When you pulled a trigger, the lever lowered the burning match into a small pan of priming powder, which then ignited the main charge. For the first time in history, a human being could keep both eyes on the target while firing. This was the moment the hand cannon truly became the gun. It changed the physical stance of the soldier. Instead of crouching over a metal pot on the ground, soldiers began to stand tall, tucking the butt of the weapon into their shoulder to absorb the recoil. This small mechanical tweak, the matchlock, triggered a cascade of changes in how humans fought. But wait. Because here is where the story gets even weirder. As guns became common, armor didn't just disappear, it got thicker. For about 100 years, there was a literal arms race between the gunsmith and the blacksmith. Knights began wearing proofed armor, breastplates that had been shot with a pistol at close range to prove they could withstand the impact. You can still see the bullet dents in museum pieces today. They were a mark of quality. But the gun eventually won because of a brutal mathematical reality. Lead is cheaper than steel. A lead bullet could be cast by a child in a campfire, but a suit of armor required a master craftsman and months of labor. Eventually, the cost of staying safe became higher than the cost of killing, and the age of the armored knight came to a crashing, violent end. Yet there was still a major flaw. If you were a soldier carrying a matchlock, you were walking around with a literal open flame in your hand. If you tripped and fell into a pile of gunpowder, you'd blow yourself and your friends into orbit. If it was a windy day, your match would blow out. If it was night, the glowing ember was a shoot me sign for enemy snipers, which, as any soldier will tell you, is generally something you want to avoid. This led to the invention of the wheel lock, a piece of engineering so complex it was basically a clock that made sparks. It used a spring-loaded steel wheel that spun against a piece of pyrite to create fire instantly. It was beautiful, it was reliable, and it was so expensive that only the richest nobles could afford it. It was the Ferrari of the 16th century gun world. This brings us to the mystery of the flintlock. Why did it take so long to invent something as simple as striking a piece of flint against steel? We had been using flint and steel to start campfires for thousands of years, yet the true flintlock mechanism didn't arrive until around 1610, courtesy of a French courtier named Marin le Bourgeois. The flintlock was the iPhone of the gunpowder age, the perfect, simplified version of everything that came before it. It was cheap, it was weather-resistant, and it was fast. With the flintlock, the gun finally reached its final form for the next 200 years. It became the weapon of the American Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and the colonial expansion that reshaped the map of the world. But here is the most counterintuitive part of this entire 800-year journey. Even with the flintlock, the gun still hadn't reached its full potential because of a simple piece of wood. Until the late 17th century, if you were a musketeer and an enemy knight managed to get close to you while you were reloading, you were dead. You had no way to defend yourself once your one shot was fired. This is why armies still used pikemen, guys with 20-foot-long spears whose only job was to stand in front of the gunman and keep the enemy away. A 17th century army was a clunky, two-part machine that required perfect coordination to survive. Then came the socket bayonet, and honestly, it's arguably as important as the gun itself. Before the socket bayonet, people tried plug bayonets, which were literally just daggers you shoved into the barrel of your gun. The problem? Once you plugged the barrel, you couldn't fire the gun. It was a choice between having a gun or having a spear. But the socket bayonet fit around the barrel. It allowed the soldier to shoot and stab simultaneously. This one invention made the pikeman obsolete overnight. It turned every single soldier into a versatile killing machine who could handle any situation at any range. This was the infantry revolution. It allowed European powers to shrink their armies while increasing their firepower, providing the military edge that allowed small groups of soldiers to dominate much larger forces across the globe. Think about the sheer scale of that change. We started with an alchemist in a room looking for a way to live forever. Because of his failure, the entire architecture of human civilization had to be rebuilt. Before the gun, cities had tall, thin stone walls to keep people from climbing over. Once the gun and the cannon became common, those walls were useless. They would shatter like glass. So humans started building star forts, massive, low-slung, earthen fortifications designed to deflect and absorb the energy of a cannonball. We literally reshaped the geography of our cities to accommodate the physics of a gunpowder explosion. We changed the way we built our ships, turning them from floating troop carriers into massive wooden gun platforms that could project power across oceans. But let's circle back to that lab in Sichuan, because there is one final, devastating layer to this story. We often look back at the invention of the gun as a triumph of Western technology, but that is a deep, fundamental misunderstanding of the timeline. For nearly 500 years, the East was the undisputed leader in gunpowder innovation. The West didn't invent the gun. They simply inherited a technology that was already mature and spent the next few centuries perfecting the mechanical triggers. The story of the gun isn't a story of European brilliance. It's a story of a global chain reaction where each culture added one small piece to the puzzle. The Mongols provided the delivery system. The Chinese provided the chemistry. The Middle Eastern engineers provided the first refinements in metallurgy. The Europeans provided the mechanical locks. It was a horrific, collaborative effort. And yet, despite all this innovation, the deadliness of the gun stayed surprisingly stagnant for a very long time. If you stood on a battlefield in 1750, you were using a weapon that was functionally very similar to what a soldier was using in 1650. The real leap, the moment the gun became the hyper-efficient machine we recognize today, didn't happen because of a better trigger or a better barrel. It happened because of a tiny copper cap. In the early 1800s, a Scottish clergyman and amateur chemist named Alexander Forsyth got tired of his flintlock musket misfiring while he was out hunting ducks. The flash in the pan of the flintlock was slow, and the ducks would hear the click and fly away before the main charge went off. By the way, that's where the phrase flash in the pan comes from. It's a failure where the priming powder burns, but the gun doesn't fire. Forsyth experimented with fulminating chemicals that exploded when they were struck by a hammer. This led to the percussion cap. No more flint, no more sparks, no more open pans of powder, just a small, waterproof cap that ignited instantly. This was the final bridge to the modern world. It led directly to the cartridge, the repeating rifle, and the automatic weapons that would define the 20th century. It's easy to look at a gun today and see it as a finished product, a deliberate design. But when you peel back the layers, you see the singed beard of the alchemist. You see the splintered bamboo of the Song Dynasty defender. You see the frantic clockwork of the 16th century German engineer. We are looking at a weapon that was built out of 1,000 separate failures. We are looking at the ultimate accidental invention. The great irony of the gun is that it never actually solved the problem it was meant to address. The alchemists wanted to conquer death, to find a way to make the human body last forever. Instead, they found a way to make the human body more fragile than it had ever been. They wanted to build a bridge to heaven, and they ended up building a highway to the grave. If you still believe that the gun was a slow, inevitable march of progress toward a more civilized form of war, consider this one final reality that dismantles every assumption we have about the efficiency of these early weapons. We think of the gun as the end of the primitive world, but for most of its history, it was a clumsy, failing experiment. In fact, during the Napoleonic Wars, nearly 1,000 years after gunpowder was first discovered, a soldier's chance of actually hitting a target at 100 yards was less than 40%. But the psychological transition was already complete. We had traded the skill of the individual for the power of the chemical, and it all traces back to a single specific date that most history books ignore. On a Tuesday in the year 1848, the Swiss army became the last major military force in Europe to officially retire the flintlock. It took us exactly 998 years to stop using a rock to start a fire inside a metal tube, proving that for 10 centuries, we weren't just fighting our enemies, we were fighting the chemistry of our own accidental invention. The alchemist in that Sichuan lab never found his elixir. He never lived forever. But in a way, his mistake did. It lives on in every border, every fortification, and every conflict that defines our modern existence. We are living in a world built on the ruins of a failed experiment in immortality. If you ever find yourself wondering where the next great shift in human history will come from, don't look for the people trying to change the world. Look for the person who is trying to do something else entirely. And pay very close attention when they accidentally set their lab on fire. Because sometimes, the things we find while we're looking for life are the very things that change how we experience death. Before you go, I want to leave you with one question. If the gun was an accident born from a quest for immortality, what other accidents are we currently building in our labs today while we search for the next great human breakthrough? Let me know what you think in the comments. I read every single one of them. And if you want to dive deeper into these kinds of historical rabbit holes, consider subscribing. There's always another story hidden under the surface of the things we think we understand.